In the heart of ancient Egypt, beneath the scorching desert sun, an old and wise seer stood before the pharaoh's grand palace. Her eyes, clouded with age, yet sharp with a knowledge few could comprehend, glistened with fear as she spoke the prophecy that would change the course of history. "A boy will rise," she whispered. "A boy who will kill his father and marry his own mother." Her voice trembled with an ominous energy as she repeated the chilling words, "A curse that no one can escape." Those who gathered in the royal court, from noblemen to slaves, felt their hearts freeze with terror. The air became thick with unease, as if the very heavens themselves had cursed the land. The prophecy, strange and horrific, echoed in the minds of all who heard it, leaving a scar on Egypt's fate that would never heal. The pharaoh, a man whose power and wealth had once seemed infinite, now stood shaken before the words of the seer. His kingdom had prospered for centuries, built on the backs of countless slaves and the wisdom of the gods. But now it seemed as though the gods themselves had turned against him. His newborn son, the heir to the throne, would one day be the cause of his ruin. The pharaoh could not allow that to happen. In the quiet of the palace chambers, he turned to his trusted advisors, his hands trembling as he gripped the royal scepter. "This must not come to pass," he muttered, his voice thick with sorrow. "I will do whatever it takes to ensure that the prophecy is stopped before it can unfold." The decision was made in a heartbeat. The infant, so innocent and pure, would be abandoned, cast away, to die, so that the curse could never be fulfilled. But deep within the pharaoh's heart, a painful truth began to stir. The gods had already set this tragedy in motion, and no man, no king, could change what was written in the stars. The boy's fate was sealed. Under the cover of darkness, the pharaoh ordered his son to be taken far from the royal palace. Wrapped in a simple cloth, the child was placed in a small basket and left on the banks of the Nile River. The river's current would carry him away, and with it, the hope for the kingdom's future. The pharaoh, haunted by his decision, could not bear to look as his son was carried away, knowing that the life of the innocent child would be snuffed out before it could truly begin. Yet fate had other plans. As the basket floated gently down the river, the gods, it seemed, had decided that this boy's life would not end here. The very same river that had been meant to drown him, instead, became the cradle that saved him. The child was discovered by a band of travelers, unaware of the boy's royal heritage, who took him in as their own. And so, the prophecy, though seemingly halted, continued to live in the shadows, waiting for the day it would come to fruition. The child, once destined for a life of royalty, grew up in a modest home far from the grandeur of the pharaoh's palace. Raised by the kind-hearted travelers who had found him by the Nile, he knew nothing of his true origins. His days were spent in the simple routines of farm life, helping with crops, tending animals, and learning the ways of the world from those who took him in as their own. Yet, despite the love and care they gave him, something inside the boy always felt incomplete. He was different from the others. The other children in the village, though friendly and kind, could never quite understand him. There was a restlessness in his heart that none could explain. His dreams, vivid and haunting, often filled his nights. He saw visions of a grand palace, of golden thrones, and the faces of people who looked at him as though they knew him, yet he did not recognize them. He would wake with a sense of longing, as though something important was missing from his life. Though he loved his adoptive family, deep within him stirred the quiet whisper of a destiny he could not yet comprehend. The seer's prophecy seemed a distant shadow in his mind, one he couldn't quite grasp but which seemed to follow him, always lurking just beyond the edge of his consciousness. As he grew older, the boy's strange dreams began to intensify. In these dreams, he stood before a grand throne room, bathed in golden light, surrounded by people who cheered his name, and yet he was always alone. There were faces in the crowd, figures that seemed familiar, but they were always blurred, their features just out of reach. At times he felt the strong pull of an unseen force, as though something was guiding him, pulling him towards this mysterious palace. He would wake from these dreams, gasping for air, his heart racing as if the very air around him was thick with the scent of power. It wasn't just the dreams that troubled him. There was a strange pull to Egypt itself. Though he had never been there, he felt an inexplicable connection to the land of the Pharaohs. In every passing breeze, in the whispers of the wind through the trees, he felt a connection, deep and undeniable. He would hear stories of Egypt, of its ancient kings and their magnificent pyramids, and his heart would ache as though he knew them, though he had never set foot on the sacred sands. The boy, now a young man, began to realize that he could not ignore these feelings any longer. Something within him urged him to leave his humble life behind and seek the kingdom he had never known but felt he belonged to. His destiny, though hidden, was beginning to call out to him. The day finally came when the boy could no longer ignore the pull of his heart. One evening, as he sat by the fire, listening to his adoptive father's tales of distant lands and forgotten kingdoms, a strange feeling overcame him. The firelight danced on the walls, casting shadows that seemed to take on lives of their own. In that moment, he knew that he could not remain in the village any longer. His soul was restless, and the dreams, those vivid, haunting dreams, were no longer just whispers. They were becoming a roar, demanding his attention. He had to go to Egypt. He had to find the truth about himself. His adoptive parents, though sad to see him go, understood that they could not stand in the way of the path he was meant to take. With nothing but the clothes on his back and a small pouch of coins, the boy, now a young man, set off on the journey that would change his life forever. As he traveled, each step seemed to bring him closer to the land he had dreamed of. The desert winds whispered of Egypt's ancient mysteries, and the more he journeyed, the more he knew that he was headed towards something fateful. The prophecy, still a distant echo in the back of his mind, seemed to grow louder, as if the universe was beginning to align, setting him on the path he had no choice but to follow. After weeks of traveling, the young man finally arrived at the borders of Egypt. The land was unlike any he had ever seen, vast stretches of desert, broken only by the towering pyramids that rose like ancient sentinels against the clear blue sky. The air smelled different, thick with the scent of mystery and power. As he ventured deeper into the kingdom, he was struck by the grandeur of it all. The streets were lined with monumental statues, and the hustle and bustle of the city was unlike anything he had experienced in his small village. He walked among the people, marveling at their rich culture, their clothing, and the majestic architecture that surrounded him. Yet, even as he took in the beauty and grandeur of Egypt, he felt an undeniable sense of belonging. This was his place, and it was here that he would uncover the truth of his past. The very air seemed to hum with an ancient energy, as though the land itself was alive with the power of history. The young man was drawn to the palace, a place where he felt an almost magnetic pull. Little did he know, the kingdom was on the verge of a great crisis, and his arrival would set in motion events that would change the course of Egypt's future forever. The prophecy, buried deep within the past, was about to become a reality, and the young man would soon learn that his destiny was tied to the kingdom in ways he could never have imagined. Egypt, once a land of prosperity and peace, was now shrouded in chaos. The Pharaoh's kingdom, ruled with an iron fist, was on the brink of collapse. A curse, ancient and powerful, had descended upon the land. Crops failed, the rivers ran dry, and disease spread across the villages like wildfire. The people whispered in fear, their voices trembling as they spoke of the great disaster that had befallen their kingdom. The curse, they said, could only be broken by solving the riddle of the Sphinx, a mythical creature whose riddles were said to be unsolvable. But no one had managed to solve it. The pharaoh, desperate and cornered by his people's fear, issued a proclamation. Whoever could solve the Sphinx's riddle would not only save the kingdom, but be rewarded with riches beyond imagination. The Sphinx, a terrifying creature with the body of a lion and the head of a human, stood guard over the city, waiting for someone to unlock the secret that held the kingdom's fate in its claws. Yet, as time passed, hope faded. The once proud and mighty kingdom now seemed doomed, with every attempt to solve the riddle ending in failure. The people's faith in their rulers began to crumble, and whispers of revolution began to spread. It was in the midst of this turmoil that the young man, still unaware of his true identity, entered the kingdom. His arrival was like a beacon of hope in a land consumed by darkness. As the young man wandered through the streets of Egypt, he soon heard the rumors about the Sphinx. The majestic creature had stood for centuries, guarding the city's secrets, and now it held the key to Egypt's salvation. He was told of the riddle that had puzzled the greatest minds of the kingdom, a puzzle so complex that no one had been able to solve it in generations. The Sphinx's challenge had become the stuff of legend, its riddle a symbol of the kingdom's despair. It was said that anyone who could answer the riddle would gain the right to rule the land and break the curse that had plagued them all. The young man, driven by a sense of destiny, made his way toward the Sphinx. When he arrived, the creature towered before him, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light, as if it were waiting for him. The air grew thick with tension as he approached. The Sphinx, its voice like thunder, recited the riddle. I am not alive, but I grow. I do not have lungs, but I need air. I do not have a mouth, but water kills me. What am I? The crowd that had gathered around the Sphinx held their breath. The riddle was not just a test of intellect, it was a test of fate. The young man stood silently, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the puzzle before him. He could feel the weight of the kingdom's hopes resting on his shoulders, the eyes of the people fixed on him with desperate expectation. And then, with a sudden burst of clarity, the answer came to him. Fire, he said, his voice steady despite the overwhelming pressure. The Sphinx's eyes flashed, and for a moment, there was a tense silence. Then, without warning, the creature lowered its head, acknowledging his victory. As the Sphinx bowed its head in recognition, the crowd erupted in cheers. The young man stood still, his heart racing, as he realized the magnitude of what had just happened. The curse that had plagued the kingdom for so long was finally broken. The sky seemed to clear, the sun shining brighter than ever before. The river, once dry and stagnant, now flowed with life, its waters rushing through the city's streets as if in celebration. The young man, now hailed as a hero, felt a rush of emotions he could hardly comprehend. He had not come to Egypt for fame or glory, but fate had led him here. He had solved the riddle, a task that no one else had been able to complete. As the people of Egypt celebrated, he was approached by a group of the Pharaoh's advisors. They praised him for his wisdom and courage, offering him riches and titles in return for his service to the kingdom. But it was not wealth or power that caught the young man's attention, it was the queen. She had been watching from a distance, her eyes locked onto his with a look of admiration and something else, something deeper. The queen, a woman known for her beauty, intelligence, and strength, approached him, her presence commanding the attention of all around her. She offered him a gifted token of the pharaoh's gratitude for his bravery. But the young man, still overwhelmed by the events that had transpired, could not have known that this was just the beginning. The queen's admiration for him would soon blossom into something far more complicated, something that would change the course of his life forever. As the celebrations continued, the queen took the young man aside, her eyes glinting with a mysterious light. "You have saved us all," she said, her voice smooth and full of gratitude. "The curse is broken, and Egypt is forever in your debt." The young man felt a sense of pride swell in his chest, though he remained humble in the face of such praise. "I did not seek reward," he replied, his voice steady. "I only sought to do what was right for the people of Egypt." The queen smiled at him, her gaze softening with warmth. "And for that, you deserve more than thanks," she said, her words laced with an unspoken promise. "You are now the hero of Egypt, and I offer you a place by my side, not just as a hero, but as a partner, to rule this kingdom with me." The young man was taken aback. The offer was more than he had ever dreamed. To rule Egypt alongside its powerful and intelligent queen was a reward beyond his wildest imagination. Yet, despite the honor of the offer, something within him hesitated. There was a strange, unshakable feeling deep in his heart, a sense of destiny that told him this offer was not as simple as it seemed. The queen's eyes held a hidden depth, one that he could not yet understand. The very fabric of his life, which had already been turned upside down by the riddle and the curse, now seemed to twist further with this unexpected offer. What he did not know was that the queen, too, was unaware of the dark truth that lay hidden in their union. In the coming days, their bond would grow stronger, and the boy, now a man, would find himself entwined in a fate he could not escape. A fate tied to the prophecy that had haunted Egypt for generations. With the curse lifted and the kingdom restored to its former glory, Egypt flourished. The people rejoiced, for their land was once again fertile. The Nile flowed abundantly, and the shadows of fear and despair had been dispelled. The grand palace was the center of all celebrations, and the streets were filled with music, laughter, and vibrant colors. The young man, now a celebrated hero, stood by the pharaoh's side, basking in the adoration of the people. His marriage to the queen was a momentous occasion, the news spreading like wildfire across the kingdom. As he walked through the grand halls, the young man felt a sense of pride and fulfillment. He had done something no one thought possible, and now he stood beside the most powerful woman in Egypt. The queen, radiant in her beauty and grace, looked at him with warmth, her eyes full of admiration and love. Yet, despite the celebrations, the young man could not shake the feeling that something was amiss. There was a strange sense of unease in his heart, a nagging feeling that he could not quite explain. He had solved the riddle, broken the curse, and won the queen's favor. Everything seemed perfect on the surface. But deep inside, something felt wrong, as if an unseen truth was lurking just out of reach, waiting to be uncovered. The young man's unease grew as the days passed, and it became impossible to ignore. In quiet moments, when the celebrations subsided, he found himself lost in thought, questioning the strange connection he felt to Egypt. He began to wonder about his past, this true heritage. The queen, always by his side, had been kind and supportive, but something about her presence triggered a deep sense of familiarity that he could not explain. One evening, as they sat alone in the palace, the young man finally voiced his concerns. "My queen," he began cautiously, "I must confess, I feel a strange pull within me. It is as if I have known you for much longer than I can recall. There is something about you, something familiar." The queen, though taken aback, smiled softly, her eyes distant. "Perhaps you are simply feeling the weight of your destiny," she replied, her voice laced with a hint of sadness. But the young man could not be satisfied with this answer. His mind continued to race, and as the days passed, his unease turned into obsession. He sought out the palace's high priest, a man who had served the pharaoh for many years and was deeply knowledgeable about the kingdom's history. The priest, an old and wise man, had known the young man's true identity for some time, though he had kept the secret. When the young man approached him with his questions, the priest hesitated, his face filled with sorrow. "You must know the truth," the priest said, his voice heavy with regret. "You are not just any man, my child. You are the Pharaoh's son." The words hit the young man like a thunderbolt. He staggered back, his mind struggling to comprehend what he had just heard. The priest continued, his voice filled with sorrow. "You were abandoned as an infant. Your life, a secret to protect you from a terrible prophecy that foretold you would kill your father and marry your mother. The truth was out, and it was more horrific than anything the young man could have ever imagined." The world seemed to come crashing down around him as the priest's words echoed in his mind. The young man stumbled backward, his legs trembling as he struggled to understand the depth of what he had just learned. His father, the pharaoh, was not just a distant ruler. He was the very man he had unknowingly replaced. The queen, the woman he had married, was his mother. He had killed his father by unknowingly fulfilling the prophecy that had been set into motion the moment of his birth. The weight of the truth was suffocating, and the young man could barely breathe. His hands shook as the memories of his journey through dreams, the strange pull to Egypt, the connection to the palace began to align with the grim reality of the prophecy. The gods, it seemed, had planned his life from the very beginning. His destiny had been written long before he could understand it, and now it was too late to undo the damage. He had killed his father by solving the riddle and fulfilling the curse that had haunted Egypt for so long. The realization crushed him. He had been a hero to the people, a savior of the kingdom. But now he was nothing more than a tragic figure a pawn in a game of fate that he could not escape. The queen, unaware of her own connection to him, had accepted him as her husband, not knowing that he was her son. And now they were bound together by a marriage that had been destined to bring about the fulfillment of the darkest prophecy. The young man fell to his knees, his heart breaking as he realized the true horror of his actions. He had murdered his father, married his mother, and in doing so had become the living embodiment of the curse that had plagued the kingdom for so long. His tears fell freely as he whispered to the gods, asking for forgiveness, but he knew deep down that no redemption was possible. The prophecy had been fulfilled, and there was no escaping the consequences. The young man's anguish was unbearable as the truth began to settle in his heart. The weight of the prophecy, the horror of what he had unknowingly done, crushed him completely. His mind raced, but he could not escape the devastating reality. The queen, his mother, was still unaware of the truth, and he could not bring himself to tell her. He could not bear to see the look of horror in her eyes when she learned that the man she had married was her own son. But fate, it seemed, would not allow him to remain silent. The revelation spread quickly throughout the palace. Whispers filled the corridors, and soon the truth reached the queen's ears. Her eyes, once filled with love and admiration for her husband, now reflected a deep, horrific disbelief. She turned to him, her voice trembling with shock and horror. "No," she whispered. her face paling as she struggled to comprehend what she had just learned. "It cannot be true." The young man could barely look her in the eyes as the full weight of the truth crashed down upon them both. The queen collapsed in despair, her knees buckling beneath her as she fell to the floor in grief. The people of the kingdom, who had once hailed him as a hero, now viewed him with fear and disgust. The fulfillment of the prophecy had shattered the lives of all involved. The young man, overwhelmed by shame and guilt, could not escape the reality of his fate. His actions had led to the destruction of everything he had worked for the love of his mother, the kingdom's prosperity, and his own soul. He had unknowingly destroyed the very foundation of his world, and now there was no way to undo the damage. The news of the young man's true identity spread like wildfire throughout the kingdom, quickly reaching every corner of Egypt. The once joyous streets, filled with music and celebration, now lay silent, echoing only the whispers of a dark truth. The people, who had hailed him as their savior, now looked upon him with horror and fear. The curse that had once gripped their land had been broken, but the fulfillment of the prophecy had brought a new, deeper sorrow. The young man had killed his father, the Pharaoh, and married his own mother, unknowingly bringing about the very tragedy that had been foretold. The joyous celebrations for his heroism turned into a funeral procession for the kingdom's lost innocence. In every home, the people mourned not just the loss of their king, but the loss of the future they had once hoped for. The young man's heart, once filled with pride and accomplishment, now felt hollow with the weight of his actions. The kingdom that had once adored him now cast him aside as a tragic figure, a symbol of fate's cruel and inescapable grip. Even the mighty Pharaoh's palace, once a place of opulence and splendor, seemed to weep with the realization that everything they had fought for had been in vain. The people's mourning was not just for the king's death, but for the death of their hopes, their future, and the kingdom's very soul. The young man wandered through the palace, his steps heavy and slow, as if the weight of his own destiny was dragging him down. The truth of his actions weighed on him like 1,000 stones, each one more crushing than the last. His mind was in turmoil, had done everything he thought was right, had lifted the curse, had saved the kingdom, and yet, in the end, he had fulfilled the prophecy that had destroyed his life. He had killed his father, unknowingly married his mother, and brought tragedy to the land he had tried so hard to save. The faces of the people he had once admired and protected now seemed distant, almost accusatory. The cheers of victory had turned to whispers of shame. He could no longer stay in a kingdom that no longer saw him as a hero, but as the embodiment of the curse that had consumed them all. The young man made a decision that tore at the very core of his being: would leave Egypt. He would go far from the palace, far from the land that had once been his home, and live out his days in solitude, away from the memories of his past and the people who could never forgive him. His heart ached as he thought of the queen, his mother, who was now trapped in a sorrow that would never fade. The kingdom's mourning would be her eternal burden, and his departure would be the only way to spare her from the constant reminder of what had been lost. He could not bear to stay and face the people's scorn, nor could he remain by her side and add to the weight of her grief. The decision was made, but as he left the palace behind, the young man could not escape the feeling that his fate had already been sealed, no matter where he went. The queen, who had once stood by the young man's side in love and admiration, now faced a fate far worse than she could have ever imagined. The truth had shattered her world. The man she had married, the man who had become her king, was her son. Her heart ached with grief and disbelief. torn between the love of a mother and the responsibilities of a queen. The weight of the prophecy had not only destroyed her family, but had cast a dark shadow over the future of the kingdom. She was left with a broken heart, trapped between the love for the son she had unknowingly born into the world and the duties of her position as queen. The palace, once filled with warmth and celebration, was now a cold, desolate place, reflecting her own inner turmoil. She had lost the love of her life, the father of her son, and now she was forced to face a truth she could never escape. The guilt and sorrow consumed her. The kingdom had lost its hope, and the queen's heart had been shattered by the revelation of the terrible prophecy. She would forever be known as the mother who married her own son, and no matter what she did, she could never escape the consequences of that fate. The queen's reign, like the young man's, would end in tragedy. She would carry the burden of this dark truth until her final breath, forever haunted by the memory of the curse that had torn her family and her kingdom apart. As the young man journeyed away from the kingdom, the weight of his decisions gnawed at him with every step. He had sought to escape the curse that had been placed upon him, but it was clear now that fate was not something that could be outrun. The prophecy had been set into motion long before his birth, and no matter how hard he had fought against it, he could never change the course of his life. The gods had written his destiny, and no amount of courage or wisdom could alter the path they had chosen for him. His heart, once full of hope and pride, now felt hollow, emptied by the knowledge that he had caused the downfall of everything he had ever cared for. He had been a hero, a savior, a symbol of hope, but in the end, he had been nothing more than a pawn in the gods' cruel game. The kingdom he had saved now lay in ruins, and the mother he had unknowingly betrayed would carry the burden of their shared tragedy for the rest of her life. As he walked away from the ruins of his past, the young man knew that he could never escape the price of fate. The prophecy had been fulfilled, and with it, the destruction of everything he had hoped for. The gods, in their cruel wisdom, had shown him that some destinies could never be avoided. He was, in the end, the living proof of the inescapable power of fate.